Hi, this is Mike Regan, and I am thrilled to bring you another On the Record with our friend Gary Shilling. For those of you who have been tracking with us for any length of time, I think this is our 10th or 11th year, Gary, of doing these interviews. And the reason we do it is because Gary is really, really good. And what he is going to help us do today is to look behind the curtain and really try and unpack what's going on. For those of you who are just saying, well, who is this Gary Shilling guy? Go and listen to previous interviews or check out, Google him. Gary is an award-winning economist that I have been following for a lot of years. Each and every month, I read his Insight, which is probably one of the best economic newsletters that I'm aware of. And if you're interested, we can make you share with you how you can get your own subscription to Insight. It is a fabulous publication. And Gary, also years ago, I'll never forget this, and I've mentioned this numerous times, Gary, you sent me a book about deleveraging. And in that book, you explained the cycle and what's going to happen. And I think it's largely played out as you described it would. So, Gary, with that thought in mind, I'd like to welcome you to this 2023 On the Record edition here to understand what's going on in the economy.
Okay, great. Great to be with you again, Mike.
All right, Gary, well, let's just jump right in. I've done enough talking. Now it's your turn. But I will just tell you, in talking with some friends of mine, whether it's in Young Presidents Organization or other clubs and associations, I don't know that we've ever, or I have ever, and have been joined by others that have had a higher level of confusion about trying to understand which way this economy is moving. So if you could point us in the right direction, we'll get started with that simple little question.
Well, let me say at the outset, Mike, if nobody felt any confusion, guys like me would be out of business. What you want is enough confusion that I can shed some light on it, but not so much that everybody says, hey, nobody has a clue. But I think there are some things that we can, excuse me, note here. One is, I think we're in a two-stage process here in the economy. The first one, which started about a year ago, was the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve got concerned about an overheating economy. They were late to the party. They did not realize the big pickup in inflation that accompanied the reopening of the economy. They really thought that the supply chain disruptions and the reopening frictions were going to be very temporary, and that goes back to the beginning of last year. So inflation leaped. Now that added to the Fed's problems because the Fed was already under suspicion. If you go back to previous chairman of the Fed, Alan Greenspan, he was famous for what was called the Greenspan put. This was a feeling in Wall Street that he could put the bad news to the Fed. In other words, the Fed would bail out Wall Street, put in the sense of puts and calls, using that analogy. Well, of course, then you had, following him, Ben Bernanke. You had the Bernanke put, and then Janet Yellen, the Yellen put. So you came up to Jay Powell, and everybody pretty much expected the same. So he was starting behind the eight ball. And then early last year, when inflation took off and the Fed was really not on top of it, it created a serious problem. And at that point, the Fed under Powell, in effect, said, enough is enough. And I think that's a very, very important point, and one that is only slowly being recognized by markets, and whether it's with security markets or business, people just have not fully understood the Fed's commitment to bring down inflation. And they made it clear that they don't care what the consequences are, recession or not. And we very well may already be in a recession. But the point is that the Fed has really made this clear. And it's interesting, if you look what's happening, and particularly indicators of sentiment like the stock market, you go back to last year, people get convinced that the Fed is going to ease up, stocks rally, and then they come in and say, oh no, not yet. And you get a sell-off, and then another pattern, of confidence that the Fed is about through tightening, and they come back again and tell no, 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 and you get another sell-off. It's really been a sawtooth pattern along a declining trend in stocks as an indicator of this. So I think the thing we have to recognize is that the Fed is absolutely determined. They want to see inflation return to 2%, their long-term target. And by the way, I never understood why they want 2%. Why not zero? But whatever it is, that's the Fed. I'm not the Fed. But inflation is running above that, obviously, and so the Fed is really interested in reducing it. Now they have changed their pattern a bit recently. What we've seen, of course, is that goods, and this is everything from exercise bikes to crude oil prices, have been declining. And the Fed is saying, okay, fine, but we're going to concentrate on service inflation. And this includes everything from medical services to haircuts to, if you got a hair and I don't have it, that you don't have to worry about that. Mike, you're joining me. Anyway, but the Fed is concerned about service inflation. And when you worry about service inflation is much more labor intensive. In other words, by definition, there are no inventories in the service sector, and the goods used are involved are relatively small. You're in the service business. I'm in the service business. It's very different than if you're producing steel or cars or whatever. So the Fed is concerned about services, and service inflation really takes them into employment. And what's really fascinating right now is if you look at wages adjusted for inflation, they are declining, they are falling, and yet the Fed is saying, oh, they're still running too high. I mean, you're getting inflation now around 6-7%, wages around 4%. So in real terms, inflation adjusted terms, wages are declining. And by the way, that's one of the reasons I really wonder, are labor markets nearly as tight as everybody thinks? That's another issue. But the point is that the Fed is absolutely determined, and they have tightened credit. Now, the effects of that tight credit, we all know. It's certainly knocked stocks down, and particularly growth stocks. Growth stocks are very much dependent on earnings way out in the distant future. And the way a lot of people price growth stocks today is the discounted earnings in the future. And of course, and if you're talking about big earnings 5 or 10 years out, the interest rate with which you discount those is very, very important. So as interest rates go up, the present value of those earnings goes down. And that has had a huge effect on growth stocks, as we're all aware. And of course, on top of that, you're getting a lot of layoffs in that industry. Everybody from Microsoft to Meta, you go right down the list. But the Fed has had that effect, and that has really had, I think, the driving force behind the economic weakness so far, and particularly what we've seen in security markets. Now, let me just pause right there, Mike, and let's talk about that a little bit, because then I want to move on to what I think is phase 2 in this whole process.
Got it. And, Gary, if I can come back a moment, I'm taking some notes here. What I think I heard you say is that the overall economy largely influenced by Fed policy. So we had the Bernanke put, and this type of thing. Powell has said enough is enough. And so let the cards play out. And that makes it a little bit different than what we're used to seeing.
Well, not entirely, because if you look back at past business cycles, most of the time, and I think this is about 9 out of 10 times in the past in terms, if you look at stocks, but certainly if you look at recessions, they are instigated by the Fed tightening credit And when the Fed tightens credit, raises interest rates, I mentioned it affected growth stocks. It also affects housing. Housing is very, very sensitive to interest rates because it's so highly leveraged. You think about somebody who puts down 3.5% on a FHA loan, that's a 33 times leverage. It doesn't take much in the way of rising interest rates to put that borrower in trouble. And the other area that tends to be very sensitive to Fed moves are temporary employments. Those are the first to go, and we've seen weakness there as well. But what I'm saying is these things unfold as the Fed tightens. That's not the big part of the economy, but it certainly are the early signs of what's going on.
Okay, so Gary, let me just, before we go on to, the second phase, when we interviewed you back in July of 2022, you said, look, I will not officially declare it a recession, because I think you said it's not the two declining consecutive quarters of GDP, but it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics that basically just says we're in a recession or not. And you had said, I think there that while we're not officially quote unquote in recession, we're getting about as close as you'd want to before you have to switch over.
Well, just technical correction there. It's not the government. It's not the Bureau of Labor Statistics. It's an independent operation called the National Bureau of Economic Research. And these are independent. And these are the guys who first studied business cycles back in the 30s, and they delineated it. And they're the guys who make the call. Now, the reason for that is that no administration, Republican, Democrat, doesn't make a difference, would ever want to be in the business of saying, we're in a recession. Oh, no. So they pass that off to the National Bureau of Economic Research. Now, what makes this even more tricky is that this group, and these are academics, these are serious people, but they look at a lot of statistics, and of course there are always revisions, and they want to make sure when they make their call that they're never going to have to reverse it, and they don't. So they wait well into a recession before they say we've reached the peak of business. Well, at that point, having said we're in a recession, about as handy as a pocket in your underwear. I mean, everybody knows it by then. But that's the official call. So what it means is that for somebody who's a serious forecaster and people like me, you got to look at a lot of other things. You got to look at things that normally lead the economy. Stock prices are one. New orders for durable goods, housing starts, all these things that normally precede the bulk of the economy. So it's a tricky deal, but as I say, that's a kind of a technical point. But we're in a position now where the National Bureau of Economic Research has not made the call, and they very well may not for a number of months or even quarters.
Okay, but having said that, do you still retain the sentiment as you expressed in July that whether they call it or not, if we're not in a recession, we're perilously close to quote unquote a recession?
I think for anybody owning cryptocurrencies, are we in a recession? Hell yes. I mean, come on.
Gary,
how explicit you want to get?
Yeah, I think for them it's not a recession; it's a depression. As in, I'm seriously depressed.
Oh okay, yeah, it's a disaster. It's a disaster for them.
Yeah. So let's go on. And let's move on to what you said was item number 2. You had the Fed policy, and you could take it away.
Yeah. Now, I emphasize that this two-part of this whole exercise, because the concentration, I think, of a lot of people, certainly security markets, but I think also the business community, has been on the Fed. But the second part is the weakness in the aggregate economy, quite apart from financial markets. And there we're getting to see that. And what does that mean? It means weakness in the economy and weakness in corporate profits. And we're beginning to see that unfold. If you look at CEOs and where do they think we stand, these surveys show they think we're in a recession. You look at corporate profits estimates, they're being cranked down. If you look at the evidence that suggests the economy is slipping, it's there. This is unfolding. This is the second half. This is what I think will consume a lot of the rest of this year. But it's the weakness in the economy and reflected in general business weakness and certainly in corporate profits and general business. So that's the part where I think we're entering now. Does that mean that the Federal Reserve is not important? No. But I don't think that's the primary place to be looking. I'm much more interested now in what's happening, what I hear from businesses, how they're reacting, sentiment. You look at, for example, small business. That index just came out. That's very definitely in recessionary territory. All these surveys of what's really going out there on the ground in the general economy. Consumers, their spending in inflation-adjusted terms is declining. Their wages in adjusted for inflation are declining. You're getting a general weakness overall in the economy, in the goods and services economy, is what I'm really talking about.
Okay. Well, I apologize here. I'm taking copious notes, Gary. But for example, I guess the thing that's been a little bit confusing to me and others is that I don't want to get into the political aspect. Like you said, no administration wants to say, we're in a recession. But it seems like the justification for the economy being quote unquote sound are the labor statistics, okay, that we're at full employment. There are those that say that's a highly manufactured number that doesn't really encapsulate what's going on. Help us understand your thoughts.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, for example, the numbers that are announced the first Friday of the month, there are two employment numbers. One of them is the payroll survey, and that's the one that gets the most attention. And that's really a survey of employers, and they say how many people are on your payroll, okay, and they compile those numbers and adjust them and so on. The second series, which is taken at the same time, is a household survey, and that's actually going around and asking Americans, households, what's going on? Are you employed? Are you looking for work? Are you discouraged because you haven't found out? A lot of very interesting data. Now, what's interesting, in the last year, the payroll survey shows 1 million more people employed, an increase than the household survey. There's a lot of differences going on there. And there's a lot of things that can be confusing here. For example, in the payroll series, let's say a company is based in, let's say it's based in Chicago, but they got offices in Los Angeles. Now, when they come around for the payroll survey and say, what do you have in the way of job openings? That number may be reported in Chicago and at the same time reported in another office, Los Angeles or whatever. In other words, there may be a lot of duplication. These numbers, and you pointed this out, these numbers are highly suspect. The one thing that I keeps stuck in my craw on this is, if labor markets are really as tight as a lot of people think, why is it that wages adjusted for inflation are declining? And they are. They've been declining for over a year. And you sort of say, what's going on here? Now, you might say initially that it was a matter of catching up, but I don't think that really explains what's going on. It's a difficult issue to decipher, but what we are seeing, though, regardless of that, is that labor markets are starting to ease up. When you look at number of people applying for unemployment insurance, that's going up. If you look at the number of people who are quitting because they think they can find other jobs, that number has gone down. A number of these numbers are starting to suggest that labor markets are easing up. So regardless of how tight they were to begin with, they're moving toward ease.
Okay, I can only tell you, I mentioned this to you before. I've been very involved in CEO, president organizations like YPO. And there is an easing. Labor recruitment and retention was one of the three areas in 2020, 2021, and 2022 that everybody was experiencing. It was inflation, supply chain disruption, and labor recruitment and retention. That has eased up a bit, but the aspect that people are, still trying to figure out is, where do we go from here? I mean, we're in February now. And so please share some thoughts to those C-level executives that are listening to this, these VPs, directors, supply chain, logistics, et cetera. What do we expect over the next 6 months until we get together again in July or August?
Well, I think any business, you start with their sales and their profits. I mean, that's where I think any business starts in determining what their strategy is. And as they soften, and I think in a lot of businesses they are softening, will continue in this second phase that I described earlier, then people have to look at their payrolls. Now, what has happened there, of course, is a lot of people have had problems in employing people they wanted. They really have been searching for employees. So what that has done is it's made people a lot less willing to lay people off when they just spend so much time trying to hire them. So I think that we're going to get a delayed action there. And my feeling is to people is think ahead and just think, if your sales and your corporate earnings are going to decline, what are you going to do with your payrolls? And if you really think, as I do, that those profits and sales are going to go down, why wait? You might at least curtail hiring plans. You may be less zealous to retain people. You may even move toward laying people off. And you look at particularly the tech industry. You've had huge layoffs there, and it's spreading to general business. Matter of fact, we're just putting together some numbers for our next monthly newsletter, Insight, a whole list of companies that have made layoffs. And sure, a lot of them are in the tech industry, but those areas, they hired like crazy back in 2021. And yeah, they're laying off, but only a fraction of all the people they hired. But when you get to run-of-the-mill, much more economically oriented companies, and you see layoffs there, you say, hey, this is reflecting general business.
Gary, just anecdotally, I don't know if this is something that's a point of reference for your Insight article. I mean, when I make it into the Insight, I've been in the Wall Street Journal and others, but when I make it into Insight, Gary, that's the big time. I know I will have arrived, okay?
Flattery will get you everywhere, Mike.
But let me just offer an observation. What you said is people in the manufacturing sector in particular, they are not laying off because they are fearful that if they do lay off, they're not going to be able to recover when the business comes back. And so I've been to numerous conferences, and this ties in with what you said before. Like in the trucking industry, truckload rates are down by 15 to 25% year over year, even though the cost structure is still elevated and higher. And so, the CEO of one company said, the reality of it is, last year our margins were X, 18, 21%. This year our margins are going to be 8 to 10%. And, the good news is we still have margin.
Yeah, that's a good news.
The bad news is it isn't going to be anywhere near what like one friend of mine just said, 2022 was really the zenith for truck earnings and logistics earnings.
Yeah.
And so the question that I asked then is, if that's going on, not just in the transportation sector, but I think you said across sectors, that to a certain extent creates a flywheel effect, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. And what I'm saying here, everybody running a business knows, and that is that when sales go down, costs do not go down as fast,
Yep.
regardless. And for no other reason than overhead costs just cannot be cut as rapidly as sales weakness. And okay, maybe you get layoffs, but there's severance costs and so on and so forth. So it's one of these things where you really just can't. Very few businesses can control their costs in step with their sales and profits.
Okay, Gary, let's switch gears a little bit. We've covered the Fed tightening. We've covered the, profitability, earnings coming out. Those were the two big ones. Let's go into a global realm, okay? Because you are probably one of the shrewdest observers of taking a look, not just at North American centric activity, but global. Do you see risk to the economy, Russia-Ukraine war? The other thing that is a mystery to me is what's going on in China. I will simply tell you what's scary to me is we have in these associations asked some of our members, like in China, to discuss what's going on. No one will say a word. The only word they'll say is interesting, as in it's interesting.
Well, they want to stay out of jail.
Well, and practically speaking, Gary, one of the things that we are seeing is an enormous uncertainty about China. When does it get back on? I mean, like right now, ocean rates, to give you an idea, last year, August of last year, containers were 20 to 25,000. Today, they're moving at 900 to 1,500.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So help us understand. Let's talk about the global risk out there and your thoughts on that.
By the way, before I get into that, just an anecdote I saw on TV last evening. There's a program of people in the state of Maine that build houses, and they're resurrecting cabins and all this. Well, this segment was on an outfit that takes containers, 40-foot containers, and of course there's plenty of those because the goods are coming in here faster than they're going out. And they talked about how these guys, sawed up the steel sides and put in windows and build a whole house out of a 40-foot container and haul it up to Maine. They even put a roof deck on it. I mean, I'm not sure I want to leave in anything quite that narrow, but it was interesting.
Honey, I've gone from a double wide to a container.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm surprised they didn't just weld two of them together. But I mean, how you can live and think, what are they, 8 feet wide? This is a little tight. But anyway, yeah, you look at so save your containers, boys. There might be a big market for cabins in the Maine woods. Anyway, okay, what's going on internationally? Well, we've got the usual array of problems. You are all aware of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the West has finally decided we've got to support Ukraine. The next couple of months look kind of scary because there's all the Western sophisticated equipment going to get there quick enough to stave off the Russians. And it's, I don't know if it's going to be a stalemate or what, but it doesn't seem to be escalating to a great degree right now. You mentioned China. China's much more interesting because China had this complete lockdown with COVID. Now, we got to keep in mind that China is a top-down economy, very different than ours. There's no organized opposition. If there is, they end up either dead or in jail. The choices are very simple. So what we've seen in China, we had this complete lockdown with COVID, tremendous impact on the economy, and on top of that, they've had a big sell-off in housing. Housing was one of the few places that people could put money. There's no real meaningful stock market. They can't move money out of the country for foreign investments, so they put it in housing. And that got extremely overbuilt and a lot of problems there. A lot of these Chinese housing companies would take money from people for mainly apartments that they were going to build later. And then they ran out of money, and these people are stuck with they've put down maybe 40, 60%, and they have nothing to show for it. So you've got a weakness in the housing sector. What the Chinese government does not show a particular zeal to bail out. It's not politically sensitive to the degree it is in this country. And they've got plenty of infrastructure, plenty of roads, and so on and so forth. So the Chinese economy and the Chinese consumers are very cautious. What do? When they get scared, they save more money. They're saving about $2.5 trillion at annual rates, a big amount. So the Chinese economy really isn't going anywhere right now. And the idea that this is going to resurrect the rest of the world, the spending that is going on in China is in the consumer area. And it's not exuberant, but it's stronger than housing or capital spending. But it's domestic. And so to the extent that it does provide any strength, and the estimates are now that the Chinese economy may grow 5% this year versus 3% last year. Hey, it used to grow 10% regularly. So it's a big slowdown regardless. But the point is, it's not showing up in ways that are going to affect the rest of the world that much. It isn't a matter that it's going to be a big push for exports. We're going to end up in North America and Europe. It isn't a case of where there's going to be huge expansion of demand for materials, iron ore, copper ore, et cetera, et cetera. So I think China is much more a domestic economy, and its effects on the rest of the world are going to be much less than they have been in the past. Now, of course, you've always got China in terms of their military ambitions, and they have this Belt and Road policy everybody's familiar with, where they were really trying to put their imprint on all these countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so on. They invested a lot of money there, lent money to these countries, and a lot of their investments, of course, have just disintegrated. An interesting thing that the Chinese, that their foreign aid is in the form of loans. We just say, hey, we're never going to get it back anyway. We might as well make it grants. There's that distinction. But they make it in loans. And of course, these loans are no good. Now, that doesn't hurt China because, China, they've got these huge savings and they can write it off one way or the other. But the point is that that is not an area which is any longer expanding. So I think, China is much more a domestic oriented economy right now. And unless they embark on some big foreign adventures like invade Taiwan or something like that, which I don't expect, but I'm not a military expert. I don't think China is going to make a lot of difference.
Just one thought, Gary, I'd appreciate your insights on this, but I've heard numerous people talk about China, Taiwan issues type thing. One particularly astute analyst basically said, what people overlook is China doesn't need to invade Taiwan. China can impose a blockade, and because Taiwan is an island, you can basically bring Taiwan to its knees, economically speaking. The issue then becomes, is that something that China is willing to do and risk, the opprobrium of the world stage? I don't know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that's the important question. Sure, they could put a blockade. They could, have warships circling Taiwan and prevent any exports or imports or so on and so forth. But again, what's the rest of the world's reaction? The Chinese they're really conservative. They're not looking for big time wars. They want to increase their presence on the global chains. They want to supplant the U.S. as the leading country in the world. But I think for what we know of them in the past, they're not willing to risk all-out war confrontation with the West to do so. They'll push and shove wherever they can. But I don't think, and hey, I'm not a military expert, Mike, but I don't think that they're willing to risk the kind of retaliation they would get if they were to blockade Taiwan.
Okay, Gary, as we're heading into the home stretch here, it wouldn't be a Gary Shilling interview if I didn't ask you about the European situation. Like you take a look at Britain doesn't look like it's particularly healthy. The European Union doesn't look like it's particularly healthy. And any thoughts on that?
I think those, I think you're right, Mike. Those areas are just kind of drifting along. Um, they're not collapsing, but they're not really growing, and they're not going to be the engine of global growth in terms of influence on the U.S. They say it's not a, it's not a disaster. It's not a big growth story. It's kind of middle of the road. Not much really happening. It's not really the focus of attention right now.
Okay, one of the other things that you and I have periodically reminisced about or just kicked around is the possibility of black swan events. I would tell you, I jokingly said, in 2021, 2022, the undisclosed story is the number of black swans that got released from the cage because they were prolific, procreating,
Well,
and it was one shock after another.
uh,
But you typically you in your insights you do a great job of talking about a lot of different things, commodities being one of them. You take a look, for example, at oil. You see oil being relatively stable, or does it go much higher if China comes back on stream?
just an aside, you mentioned black swans. Everybody's talked about that as being uh, highly improbable, and then somebody pointed out they actually do have black swans in Australia. There is such a bird. And
Put a
anyway,
ban on them. Put an
yeah,
embargo.
yeah, there always are these tail risks, is another way of putting it. And from our long association, Mike, that I spent a lot of time looking for the hidden flaws. I think I've had a pretty good track record on that. I was very early and on top of the big housing subprime mortgage bonanza, and before that, the dot-com stock blow off in the late '90s, and then of course the global recession resulted from the dot-com collapse. So I'm just saying this is the kind of thing that I spend my time on. I'm not one of these people like I think most economists who are paid to be bullish. And that's one of the reasons I run my own operation, because that can be hazard to your professional health, as I think you know. I got fired twice by Don Regan, who was then head of Merrill Lynch, for being bearish. So that's those are my credentials. Having said that, I just don't see anything right now that's out there that's likely to erupt. Yeah, you can always say that Ukraine is going to blow up. That Russia is going to take over Ukraine, move into other related countries, that then NATO will have to respond. Yeah, that's certainly possible. Is that likely? I'm not a military expert, but I wouldn't put a high probability on it. China, we talked about invading Taiwan. Likely, probably not. They don't want to see the response. I don't see anything out there that really is monumental. Now, of course, one thing that we're keeping our eyes on are a lot of these speculations that we had earlier, the crypto speculations, the SPACs. That the Federal Reserve, and the administration pumped out a lot of money in response to the COVID crisis. And a lot of that money, where did it go? And it went into single family housing, and it went into security markets. And that gave us a lot of this speculation. Now those areas are, we talked about earlier, they basically have collapsed, but they're not of the magnitude of the subprime mortgage disaster in the mid 2000s. In other words, you don't have a situation where a vast percentage of the population is involved in that. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty spectacular when you see what's happening, but it's relatively combined in terms of the aggregate economy. So, that's an area I'm certainly watching, but I just don't see it as being big enough to sink the entire ship.
Okay, Gary, I really appreciate your time, but I'd be remiss. There is something you said, though, that just, I don't think I'm alone in asking this question. Okay. And that is, economically speaking, it seems like we've suspended the law of gravity. And what I mean by that is, you have $31 trillion worth of debt. The impact of interest on that debt from a budget perspective the fact is with entitlement programs, I don't care if it's Democratic or Republican, that debt is going to continue to grow. Okay. And yet it doesn't seem to be having any discernible, tangible impact that people experience and can say, wow, we need to drive down this debt. Bring me back to reality. Does gravity still apply on the economy?
Oh, as you know, Mike, I am no fan of government deficits or debt, and for a number of reasons. But one of them is I think a lot of the spending is is not productive, and I'd rather see the money spent on productive things that increase the activities in the economy and ultimately benefit everybody. So I'm no fan of this. But having said that, you look at this situation. Now, you might recall a couple of years ago, we did a fairly exhaustive study on what we call the debt bomb, which is what you're describing. We said, okay, what happens if you get this big debt and then the interest on that debt? And of course, as interest rates go up, the interest on the debt gets bigger. And we said, at what point does that get to the point where interest on the debt becomes a huge part of the deficit, adds to the debt, and the whole thing grows geometrically? And that's what I call the debt bomb. Well, now we look back historically and said, okay, we've never had that. But how close do we came? If you go back to 1997, which was the peak of this, at that point, if you look at interest on the debt in relation to the economy, it was about 6% of GDP, total economy. Now you said today, what would it take to get back to that level? We know that didn't create the debt bomb, but that's the closest we ever got. And what it would say is that interest on the debt, which is now about 3%, because most of the government debt is very short term, it would have to go to about 8%. Now, how could you get to 8%? In other words, how could you get to interest on the federal debt at 8%? Well, one way would be to have absolutely runaway inflation, the kind of thing we had back in the late 60s and 1970s. But Powell at the Fed, I think, is saying, no way, Jose, on that one. Another one is if you had complete lack of confidence in the federal government, and that, but you say, how would that happen? What are the alternatives? Where would people, Americans and more importantly, foreigners, where would they put their money? There's no great options out there. I mean, China would like to have their currency as an international currency, but money doesn't go to control currencies. Europe has got enough problems. UK, that was fine a century ago, but it really isn't that size. The Japanese don't want their economy to be international. In other words, you sort of, maybe you can say that the U.S. and the dollar is the cleanest shirt in the laundry. The valedictorian in summer remedial school, but the other options are not so hot.
Every interview, you get that in.
Oh yeah, got to get that one in. I love that one. Now, it is an issue, but as I say, as you pull it apart and try to say, okay, fine, what would it take to really put us into this debt bomb? And I think you've got to, if we got there, boy, there'd be an awful lot of things I'd be a lot more worried about than that at that point.
Okay, so one of the questions I've asked you, I think we've done over 20 interviews, and I always have to ask this one. You're sitting on a company board, a 50 million, 100 million, 500 million, $5 billion company. The CEO is sitting there saying, okay, what do we plan on the next 6 to 12 months? Or, I always laugh people that go out 3 years, 5 years and this type of thing. I'm like, you certainly got to be kidding me. But my question is, you're sitting there as a board member. What's your advice to me?
Be cautious. I think it's be cautious. I don't think it's a situation where you want to say, hey, we want to crawl in a hole and pull the hole in after us. It's not the end of the world. But I think it's a point where people ought to be cautious. Liquidity is always handy in times like this. Cash goes from trash to king. And I think having a strong fortress-like balance sheet for most companies is a very, very prudent approach in the current situation.
Okay, but that goes back to a final, I hate to keep asking an appendix to the final question, but doesn't that basically do what we talked about 15, 20 minutes ago, create a self-fulfilling economic prophecy?
Well, sure, but we're sitting on this corporate board, right, for this company of 50, 100 million. We're not sitting on the board that runs the whole GDP at $14 trillion. We're worried about this company. Okay. Now, if you and I are elected president, we can then worry about the whole country. But no, we're worried about this company.
That's great advice. Hey, Gary, final thoughts, anything that I missed, anything of the, they always ask, anything that keeps you up at night as you look out into the window, anything that you would want to share with the audience?
No, I appreciate this opportunity to say, as you mentioned at the outset, we do have a monthly newsletter that you've been very charitable in talking about. And if anyone would like to have a sample copy, let us know. Mike, you can gather up any emails and send to us, and we'll send out a sample copy. We're going to be coming out with our March issue in the next couple of weeks, and people might find it useful.
Listen, I give that a hearty endorsement. I've been a subscriber for a long time. My wife Jean and I. The thing that we've always liked about it, Gary, is like you said, Donald Regan. Namesake, no relation, but Donald Regan there, didn't like your bearish sentiments. But one of the things that we do appreciate is what I call a reasoned, some dispassionate discussion about these factors and let it be. So we'll get that information out for people. And Gary, I just want to say thank you for your time. This has been great fun. Thank you so much.